The sun dipped into the Atlantic, marking the end of a 14-hour shift. Daniel Torres leaned against the railing, his body heavy with the fatigue of a long day on the cruise ship. Behind him, the deck buzzed with laughter. His colleagues were already moving toward the bar, ready to trade their hard-earned tips for drinks and watches. Daniel did not follow. He turned away from the noise, navigated the narrow corridors, and ducked into his cabin. It was barely larger than a storage closet, a tight space filled only with the hum of the ship. He did not sit on the bed. He went straight to the small desk, pulled out a notebook, and opened it to a fresh page. He uncapped his pen and began to list every cent he had spent since dawn. The numbers were his only focus. While others sought a temporary release in the evening, Daniel sought the cold, hard logic of his ledger. He reached for his calculator, the plastic clicking in the silence of the room, and began to tally the day. Every entry was a calculation. Every cent saved was a brick in a wall he was building against the uncertainty of his life. The ledger entries blurred as the memory surfaced unbidden. He saw the kitchen table in his childhood home, covered in stacks of past-due notices. He remembered the sound of his father's boots hitting the floor at 4 in the morning, day after day. His mother's hands were always raw, skin cracked from years of scrubbing floors, yet the bills never stopped arriving. The cycle was a physical weight that pressed down on their dinner table every single night. Daniel watched his parents labor until their backs bent, trading every hour of their lives for a paycheck that vanished before the week was out. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. Hard work was not enough if he remained a servant to his time. He stared at the empty space on his desk, his hand gripping the pen until his knuckles turned white. He would not live like this. He would not trade his life for a wage that bought only survival. He made a vow in the silence of the cabin. He would own the assets. He would control the mechanism. Fiverr again let a bill dictate the boundaries of his existence. The ledger sat open, but the numbers no longer felt like enough. Daniel needed a strategy, not just a tally. He found the answer on a dusty shelf in the crew library, a worn, dog-eared copy of a book by Napoleon Hill. He opened it during his next break, the ship rolling beneath him. His eyes locked onto a single sentence. Every great achievement begins with a definite purpose. The words burned in his mind, stripping away the vagueness of his ambition. His purpose was not just money. It was real estate. He closed the book and pulled out a stack of trade magazines he had scavenged from the port. He stopped recording grocery costs and started recording property values. He mapped out market trends, analyzed rent-to-value ratios, and learned the mechanics of leverage. The cabin became an office. He pushed his bunk aside, spread blueprints and property brochures across the floor, and traced the lines of potential investments. He was no longer just a crew member waiting for a paycheck. He was a student of the market, preparing for the day he would stop working for his money and start making his money work for him. Years collapsed into a singular, repetitive rhythm of salt air and steel walls. The ship crossed the Atlantic dozens of times, but for Daniel, the geography of his life did not change. He was confined to the same narrow cabin, the same engine drone, the same 14-hour shifts. Invitations to crew gatherings at port bars were met with a closed door. He missed his sister's wedding, his father's birthday, and every holiday that kept the rest of the world anchored to their families. The silence in his room was absolute. When the weight of that solitude reached a breaking point, he reached for his ledger. He opened the binder to the latest page. He ran his finger down the columns of figures, watching the total climb with every passing month. Those black ink numbers were his only company. They were the physical evidence of his progress. He compared the current balance against the previous year's tally, noting the steady, incremental gain. The isolation was a price he paid with full awareness. He did not look at the ocean outside his porthole anymore. He looked at the bottom line. Every dollar saved was a brick in the foundation of his future, and he would not stop until the structure was complete. The ship docked in Florida, and Daniel bypassed the tourist traps for a sterile conference hall near the coast. He sat in the back, notebook open, listening to a speaker detail the mechanics of property acquisition. The words were precise: cash flow, leverage, equity. He realized that saving was only the first step. He had been hoarding bricks, but he needed a foundation to build on. The speaker explained how debt, when managed, multiplied capital. Daniel took notes, his pen moving faster than the lecturer spoke. He saw the logic click into place. He could use a small amount of his own money to control a larger asset. He could leverage the bank's capital to accelerate his growth. He left the seminar before the closing remarks, his mind racing through calculations. Back on the ship, the cabin air felt different. He looked at his budget and found more to trim. He cut his remaining personal expenses to the bare minimum. Every coffee, every snack, every non-essential purchase was eliminated. He replaced his meals with the cheapest options available in the galley. He was no longer just saving for a goal. He was operating a business, and he treated his personal finances with the cold, calculated efficiency of a corporation. The ship was his platform, and he was ready to deploy his capital. The target was a duplex in a quiet market, identified through months of late-night research. Daniel tracked the listing for weeks, waiting for the price to dip. When the notification finally pinged on his laptop, he knew the window was closing. He had spent years accumulating the down payment, and now he had to commit it all in one stroke. He sat at his cramped desk, the ship swaying beneath him, and pulled up the digital contract. His hand hovered over the trackpad. This was the culmination of every missed holiday and every skipped meal. If this failed, he would have nothing but a decade of empty time. He read the terms 3 times, checking the math against his ledger to the last cent. He clicked the button to sign. The document uploaded through the ship's erratic satellite connection, crawling slowly toward the server. He watched the progress bar, his heart hammering against his ribs. He felt the weight of every dollar he had sacrificed transferring into a legal binding on a screen. The upload hit 100%. He closed the laptop. The deal was done. He had traded his liquid security for a future asset. Now, there was only the wait. The wait stretched for weeks. Daniel continued his shifts, scrubbing decks and hauling supplies, his mind constantly pulling back to the inbox. Then, the notification arrived. It was not a digital ping this time, but a physical envelope waiting at the ship's mail office. He took it to his cabin and sat on the edge of his bunk. He slit the paper open with a steady hand. Inside was a check from his property manager. He pulled it out and held it under the dim cabin light. The numbers were exact. He had performed no labor for this specific amount. He had been sleeping while the tenants lived in the unit, and yet, the money had moved into his account. He stared at the check, tracing the ink with his thumb. The mechanism was real. It was not a theory from a seminar or a calculation in his ledger. It was tangible. He had successfully decoupled his income from his hours. The exhaustion of his 14-hour shift suddenly felt irrelevant. He tucked the check into his notebook, right beside his expenses. The fear of the initial risk vanished, replaced by a cold, sharp clarity. He knew exactly what he had to do next. The first check was the spark, but the fire demanded more fuel. Daniel did not celebrate. He did not buy a single luxury. Instead, he took the rent money, added his base savings, and targeted the next listing. The process became a rapid cycle. He learned to identify properties that required minor repairs, using the cash flow from the first duplex to secure the down payment on the second. Within 6 months, he held 2. By the end of the year, he had 4. His ledger grew crowded with rows of mortgage payments, maintenance costs, and net gains. On the ship, his hands were still calloused from manual labor, but his mind was elsewhere. He watched the clock during his shifts, no longer tethered to the pay cycle of the cruise line. The ship sailed across oceans, but his assets stayed grounded, accumulating value while he moved through time zones. He was building a machine that functioned without his presence. Every time he stepped off the deck, he checked his messages to see the latest balance. The numbers were climbing, moving faster than his labor ever could. He was no longer just a crew member. He was a collector of assets, and the empire was taking shape. A younger crew member leaned against the railing beside him, watching the sunset. He looked at Daniel, then down at the worn deck shoes, and finally at the notebook in Daniel's hand. "Why do you stay here?" the young man asked. "You have been here for years. You never buy anything nice. You never join us for a drink." Daniel did not turn his head. He pointed toward the horizon where the sun hit the water. "You see the sunset?" Daniel said. "It is pretty, but it ends in a few minutes. I see 10 years from now." He tapped the ledger. The math was clear. For the first time, his monthly rental income had surpassed his base salary from the ship. The shift was absolute. He had achieved the goal he set when he was a boy watching his parents struggle with bills. The crew member stared, confused by the lack of immediate reward in Daniel's life. Daniel simply closed the notebook. He did not need to explain the mechanics of equity or leverage. The numbers in his ledger spoke louder than any argument. He was finished with the cycle of trading time for cash. The horizon was no longer a destination. It was a deadline. He stayed for 2 more years. He did not need the money, but he demanded the absolute certainty of his exit. He watched the final passengers disembark, his ledger tucked securely into his bag, the numbers now fully detached from the necessity of his labor. When the ship finally docked in its home port, he waited for the deck to clear. He walked to the gangway, the metal grating under his boots feeling different than it had for a decade. He reached the bottom and stepped onto the concrete of the pier. He did not look back immediately. He stood still, listening to the hum of the ship's engines one last time, recognizing the sound of a life he had outgrown. He took a deep breath, the air smelling of salt and exhaust, and then turned his head. The massive steel hull loomed against the sky, a relic of the man he used to be. He looked at it for a long, silent moment. No resentment remained, only the clarity of a finished task. He turned his back to the water and began to walk. The path ahead was his own. He was a landlord. He was a millionaire. The cycle of trading time for survival was over.